Episode 6, AD 680 to 754. Most people nowadays are completely unaware that half the Roman Empire was conquered in a religiously animated invasion launched from what is today Saudi Arabia. They do not know that in that moment a region which had previously not existed and that we think of today as the Middle East was first created. Outside a closed circle of academic specialists, our collective memory in this regard is a blank. For we have forgotten what the Middle Ages knew, that a central part of what they had known as the world had been wrenched from them, that their society and its self-understanding had suffered what might be called a civilizational amputation. A major limb was no longer attached, but the society's nervous system continued acutely to feel the phantom pain in its absent extremity. The Islamic invasions were not normal in the sense of bringing about a mere change in the personnel who ruled a society that continued in its old established ways. Because over the subsequent 3 or 4 centuries, for the people of the eastern and southern Mediterranean, Muslim rule effected fundamental alterations in their culture, in what it is like to experience living life. Looking over the whole course of European history, I would suggest that these conquests were the most consequential among historical events. Because without them, that they were a kind of immense accident and historically unprogrammed eruption, without those conquests, the Roman Empire, in all probability, would have continued as it always had, on its set and ancient course. Constantinople would have, for many, many centuries, remained the heart and core of the Mediterranean world, as it would have remained at the center of its communications and of its commerce, and it would have continued to set the standard for the whole region's evolving cultural life. Without the Islamic conquests of Syria, Egypt, and super-Saharan Africa, the Roman Empire, which in fact survived until the mid-1400s, could have continued as a great power well into what we call the early modern period, into the 1500s and 1600s. The corollary of this speculation is that the Occident may not have emerged as firmly as it did, as a society and cultural variant in its own right. Europe may not have emerged in the way that it did. The long-term effects of a continuation of Roman power are, of course, incalculable, but certainly the Mediterranean would have remained an integral society, a political, economic, and cultural realm. But the normal course of events, the natural continuation of the ancient Mediterranean society, was not to be permitted by history. Instead, an enormous rupture occurred, creating 2 opposed civilizations, 2 tectonic plates, abutting and inexorably pressing upon one another, producing inevitable earthquakes. In principle, and usually, but not always in practice, these civilizational spheres were rootedly hostile to one another. The wrenching off of the Roman Empire's southern Mediterranean lands inescapably had the effect of crippling it. Slowly, during the 900s, the Greek-speaking empire made a remarkable comeback, and for a time even seemed to have succeeded in turning the tide of history. But in 1071, a vaster and unpredicted dynamic within the Islamic world overwhelmed even that. And so, in the period covered in this episode, during the 700s AD, as a result of the loss of the south and the east, the framework was set within which the wilder westward periphery of the Romano-Christian world, the Latin Occident, began to go its own way. It did so because it found itself in a drastically shrunken world. A century before, in 600 AD, the West had consisted of, first and foremost, Sicily and Italy with the Dalmatian coast. Then came the province of Africa with Carthage as its capital. These were still, despite the inroads of the Lombards, integral elements within the Roman Empire. Next came the autonomous sub-Roman kingdoms, firstly Gothic Iberia, with its Romanness weighted in the south and east, and continuing through Septimania, an extension of Iberia, across Provincia, Provence, to Liguria in northwest Italy. This civilizational sphere, Western Romania, sharing from time immemorial a common language, religion and way of life, and to some extent still a common government, was bound together through transport networks and institutional exchanges. But between 680 and 720, it too suffered an enormous shock, losing half its population, its cities and ports, to the Muslim invaders. The impact of these two circles of collapse, the inner one of the Western Mediterranean and the wider one of the Mediterranean as a whole, was profound, for it removed the very motor of the ancient economy and drastically disrupted its communications and customary supply lines. The setback was so severe that it has allowed us, in recent centuries, to sensationalize that setback as the Dark Ages, and to extrapolate those events backwards to 2 centuries earlier as a sudden and complete collapse of civilization, and to blame that upon the Germanic ruling class in a movement we have called the barbarian invasions. Although there was serious political and economic disruption during the 400s and 500s, it should be noted that this mainly occurred at the edges of the Roman world, not in its heartlands. The loss of imperial revenues from Iberia, Gaul and Britannia certainly politically weakened Italy, but this made Italy itself only more dependent upon Constantinople and drew it further into its sphere of influence and control. The loss of these western peripheries, Iberia and Gaul, was not seen as a systemic crisis at Constantinople, not at all. The common perception of there having been a fall of the Roman Empire and of ancient civilization in and around 476 AD has been marked by a Eurocentric prejudice, unwarranted by the facts. You may recognize in this description an echo of the model which historians have called the Pirenne thesis. Henri Pirenne was a great European, a man before his time. In the darkest phases of the 20th century, he saw through the shrill and false nationalist insistence that each European nation-state was composed of a completely distinct society and unique history, indeed was composed of a distinct biological race. From 1895 onwards, Pirenne began to challenge the notion that Germanic barbarians had brought down the Roman Empire, and with it, Roman civilization. While in a German prisoner of war camp during the First World War, he developed his thesis further. He pointed out the essential continuity of the economy of the Roman Mediterranean even after the so-called barbarian invasions, and that the Roman way of life did not fundamentally change for several centuries after the dissolution of the office of the Western Emperor. He published his views in the book Medieval Cities, Their Origins and Revival of Trade in 1927, and in his posthumous Mohammed and Charlemagne in 1937. I think Pirenne deserves an especially honored place in Western historiography. He saw through the obscurantism of his time and recognized a truth which Gibbon, with complete familiarity with the sources, but with his Enlightenment prejudices, failed to see. Pirenne's conceptual breakthrough struck at the roots of the key historical idea that had been asserted for the previous 500 years, and which we still stubbornly believe in: that antiquity was wantonly destroyed by hordes of horn-helmeted wild men in Western Europe. What Pirenne perceived was that the ancient world went down due to a far more consequential series of events, that is, to the Islamic invasions 2 centuries after the Germanic migrations, in both the East and the West, which precipitated the economic and social disintegration of the ancient civilization by removing the material basis and geographic prerequisites for the persistence of that particular form of life, that is, an integrated and secure Mediterranean world. So let us state this succinctly and without self-censorship. The civilization of antiquity was not destroyed by the so-called barbarian invasions, but it was by the Islamic ones. Within Islam's newly conquered area, the settlement and adaptations to their rule over the former Sassanid Empire in Iran and Iraq proceeded according to their own pattern. For the Greco-Roman people of Egypt and Syria, these gradual adaptations began to lay the foundations for a different world context. Communications were now open and regular between Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, Transoxania, and Baldukistan. The whole region of the conquest, from Libya through to Egypt, Syria, Arabia, to Iraq and Iran, was beginning to become an inner, land-orientated realm, crisscrossed by caravans of pack animals, whose coastal ports on the Mediterranean linked to one another rather than across that great sea. The reorientation of the whole region had begun. The shaming failure by Caliph Mu'awiyah to take Constantinople in 678 fed into a mix of sources of discontent among the Arab tribes. The old tribal suspicions and jealousies began to resurface, now cloaked in new religious concepts. Mu'awiyah had passed the caliphate on to his short-range son, Yazid, as an act of familial right. Oaths of loyalty had been demanded of the Arab tribal leaders in Syria and Egypt and had been given. But the tribesmen, by tradition, accustomed to seeing relations in terms of tribal identity and pride, found themselves living off the largesse given to them by the caliph through the medium of the distributive divan. The legitimacy of the Umayyad family in holding the caliphate was faced by the permanent challenge of the claimed direct religious and family link of the assassinated Ali to the Prophet. The result was a second intertribal war. To call it a civil war implies a war within a civil community, which the tribes were not. In Islam, this is known as a second fitna, which lasted from 683 to 685. The victor was another Umayyad, Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan. Raised at Medina, he was a member of the Arab elite of the new type. He had some form of education. He had been brought up at the heart of a vast dominion as a privileged son. I think we can posit for him a mentality shift, where he was no longer steeped in a purely provincial Arabian outlook, but would have had far wider imperial horizons. Abd al-Malik came to power in 685, ruling from Damascus. He continued to fight his rivals for years in Iraq, using his most effective and cruel military right-hand man, al-Hajjaj bin Yusuf. Al-Hajjaj massacred the tribal rebels wherever he found them, including around the sacred Kaaba in Mecca. As governor of the Arabian homelands in the Hijaz, he operated a ruthless despotic regime, at the slightest sign of resistance killing large numbers of ordinary tribespeople, while remaining the faithful ally and subordinate of the Caliph in Damascus. Under his rule in the Sassanid east of the Caliphate, his deputies led successful invasions of areas which are present-day Pakistan and Turkmenistan, whose populations remain deeply Muslim to this day. This period then marks the beginning of the suppression of the original community of the Arabian tribes, constituted as the Ummah, and the rise of a despotic caliphate, one with a clear imperial agenda. The Caliph in Damascus acted as the embodiment of sanctioned religious law, as the emitter of regulations which somewhat later solidified as a formal corpus of Islamic law. Abd al-Malik began to put in place a new model of the rule of Allah, conceived now as permanent and as an imperial project. He it was who broke with the practice of using the Sassanid and Roman money, and first struck his own coinage, placing his own image on one side, as the Roman emperors did. It became known as the dinar, short for denarius, the Latin name. He also made what was to be a momentous decision in its civilizational consequences. He ordered that the most important documents of the divan be translated into Arabic, and that Arabic become the language of administration and justice throughout the Caliphate. This had the consequence that over the course of centuries, the spoken language in Syria, Egypt, and North Africa would cease to be Aramaic, Syriac, Coptic, and Greek and become Arabic.
لفترس تلميذه أتو كيفو وعن هودي كيفو بوناو عيتو ديلي.
Interestingly, although Al-Hajjaj imposed the same ordinances in the Sassanid half of the Caliphate, Arabic only took root in what is now Iraq, but not in Iran, where Farsi continues to be spoken. In keeping with this change, his successor decreed that all Christians in the administration be replaced by Muslims. However, this could not be implemented immediately because of the lack of competence among the eligible candidates. Abd al-Malik and his son and successor al-Walid consciously undertook a building program to outdo the existing infrastructure of Roman temples and basilicas remaining at the center of every city. We can see this aim in two of the most famous buildings of Islamic art: the Masjid Qubat as-Sakra, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, 691 AD, and the so-called Umayyad Mosque in Damascus of 714 AD. Both buildings are based on the methods and styles of the existing Roman culture and were built by Romano-Syrian craftsmen, conforming to Islamic religious needs and embodying forms from simple structures back in Arabia. The result, with the strict banishment of all images and the consequent stress on vegetative and abstract patterns, laid the foundations for the art characteristics of Islamic civilization. The reason these developments are of importance for the history of Europe is that without them, there is every likelihood that tribalism would have torn Islamic power apart and have led to its eventual collapse. Instead, an imperial caliphate was erected, firmly based on Arabic culture and the Islamic religion, and very capable of mobilizing large-scale military force. It also meant the beginning of a long and rich tradition of political despotism. That military force was immediately deployed in Africa a year after Abd al-Malik became caliph. In 686, the Saracens took the capital of Roman Africa, Carthage. A fleet was sent from Constantinople, picking up reinforcements in Sicily, which managed to retake the city. Some 500 knights from Gothic Hispania came to reinforce the Romans and save the city. But eventually even this did not last. In 698, Carthage fell again to Hazan, who utterly destroyed it. Today, tourists can only visit its paltry ruins. Musa ibn Nuzair, a Yemeni, was made governor of the new Muslim province of Ifriqiya. A revolt by the Berber tribes was suppressed, resulting, the Muslim chronicler says, in 300,000 slaves being sent back to Egypt. The process of the Islamic conquest of North Africa had taken half a century, but its methodologies were typical. Armies, some 40,000 strong, swept through the Roman provinces in the hunt for spoils, slaves, and to reconnoitre new possible conquests. The weakness of the Roman position had become clear. The shock for the Saracens was, as it was to be in the Caucasus also, to encounter determined and effective resistance from pastoralist tribesmen, the Berbers, not dissimilar to themselves. After their bloody defeat, most of the Berber tribes went over to the Saracens and converted, to be integrated as whole tribal units into the Islamic forces of Ifriqiya. This absorption of the Berbers added a formidable reinforcement to Muslim power in North Africa, which already in the early 700s was looking further afield for new opportunities for jihad razzia in regions they had never previously known. For the Saracens now looked across the Straits of Gibraltar to Europe. Al-Malik also sought to complete the strategic goal of his predecessors. The taking of Constantinople imposed its logic once again. In 717, an 80,000-strong army under Maslama was sent by Caliph Suleiman to attack the city from the land and from the sea. The Theodosian walls and the fireships of the Roman navy enabled the city to hold out. It was resupplied with provisions from the Black Sea. An army of Bulgars in alliance with the Romans meant that the Muslims were assailed from the walls and from behind their own camps. Again, the harsh winters in the Bosphorus, the lack of supplies, and an outbreak of the plague made life intolerable. In 718, the Muslims were forced to withdraw again. Such spectacular setbacks were not part of the script of the irresistible advance of the armies of Allah across the world. Contemporaries were fully aware of what was at stake in these sieges, nothing less than the very survival of a very great civilization. Here is the Patriarch of Constantinople, Germanus, writing shortly after the second siege, quote, "Such dangers our city had never before experienced, and not only our city, but the world that is inhabited by Christians, for it may be acknowledged that without any doubt that Christ's entire flock would have been in the same peril as ourselves, had the godless Saracens attained their goal, the capture of the city, of their expedition against us." End quote. And this is beyond doubt. Just as Carolus Martellus, Charles Martel, was to stop the Muslim razzias in France some years later, the fact that Constantinople stood firm on these two occasions, when assaulted with such determination and with such massive resources, saved the Balkans and then Central Europe from Muslim invasion and cultural submersion for the following 7 centuries. By the early 700s, Christendom had already lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its territories and population, including many of its most prosperous and ancient cities. Roman Christendom found itself impaled, in both the East as in the West, on the horns of twin Islamic assaults. In episode 3, we left the Romanized Goths of Spania, Spain, at 624 AD, when the remaining footholds of Roman, that is Constantinopolitan power, were ousted from the peninsula. This already should be understood as an internal conflict within Romanitas, for the Gothic elite, after 2.5 centuries living as members of the military and political ruling class in the Occident, were completely culturally submerged by the society they ruled. They were a provincial variant of the society of late antiquity. They spoke Latin, they were devoutly Orthodox, Romano-Christians, and lived entirely as the remains of the indigenous Roman senatorial elite lived. We have dismissed them, distortively labeling them as Visigoths, and as having been both an ephemeral phenomenon and, worse, a failure. And this is a pity, for late Roman Spain was the region where the inward migration of a new military caste and their ruling order were least disruptive, and where the continuity of the Roman way of life was smoothest. Communications with Italy and with Constantinople were maintained. Clergymen went to study in Constantinople and maintained correspondence with their peers there. The style of the Romano-Gothic reges, kings, was completely imitative of the imperial court at Constantinople. They had no higher cultural or political aspiration. However, the identity of the descendants of the Gothic foederati of 2 centuries before remained sufficiently distinct for them to preserve their political independence from the empire. Their conversion to orthodoxy, to Catholicism, in 588 sealed their assimilation, and from that date they undertook a remarkable political experiment, the creation of a fully articulated, independent Roman kingdom. And this same process, of course, was also going on in northern Gaul, among the Franks of Neustria and Austrasia. But Spain was in advance of developments in the north, as its Romanness was more deeply rooted and less disrupted by the change in regime. There had been a dip in cultural standards. The elementary and secondary schools of the Forum had decayed and almost died out. For a time, education was only available within an ecclesiastical setting. But in 527, the Council of Toledo decreed the re-establishment of the publicly funded schoolmasters in the cities. Schools were established in cathedrals and in the monasteries in the countryside. For example, there is record of a Greek slave accompanying his master into a hermitage in order to study philosophy. These schools produced lay numerarii, the numbered people, who staffed the royal and urban administrations and operated the still-functioning Roman tax system. As elsewhere in the West, the Roman roads were kept in good repair by an organized corvée, that is, obligatory labor by peasants living along the routes. It is estimated that Iberia had a population of between 6 and 9 million and had 71 civitates, or incorporated cities. Basilicas were built, but the weakening of public power entailed, as elsewhere across the Mediterranean world, a piecemeal encroachment of private structures onto what had been straight public streets and open public squares. The medieval city was taking shape. In Spain, the king was elected, usually from within the royal house, by the assembly of the Romano-Gothic lords and the Catholic bishops. The traditional secular acclamation was enhanced by the archbishop anointing the king with a sacred oil, bestowing on his person and office, which were indistinguishable, a sacral character. We will, in the not-too-distant future, see pretty much the same ceremony at the coronation of the successor to the present Queen of England. This assembly discussed the laws proposed by the king, the Tomus Regius, and voted on them. From 653, the lay lords too added their signum or seal to those of the bishops to authenticate legislation. The chief offices of the Aula Regia, or the royal court, were already established. The constable, the chancellor, and the comes fiscalis, or administrator of the royal estates and revenues. Saint Isidore of Seville revised the notion of kingly power. The Eusebian model at Constantinople was replaced by the idea of a Christian monarch, the servant of his Christian subjects, more akin to that of a bishop in the church than to an autocratic emperor. Isidore's position was such that he had the power to impose this understanding upon the Romano-Gothic royal tradition. In short, we can see in the Romano-Gothic Spain of the 600s a polity that was elaborating the most characteristic features of what would later become European society. Like a controlled experiment, the test tube rapidity and clarity of this process shows us in detail the steps by which Roman society became a European society. It is a great pity that this society did not have the chance to evolve further along its road, and that so few of the documents and artifacts of Romano-Gothic Spain have come down to us. But we know the reason why. For this society was overwhelmed and almost extinguished at the beginning of the 8th century. Internal political division opened the way for exterior conquest. Society during the 600s consisted of two blocks, the potentiores, the domini or patroni, and the humiliores, the powerful and the weak. The domini progressively privatized the public realm. They had a right to raise their own armies, impose taxes, and administer justice. At the Aula Regis, or royal court, they elected the king. This dispersion of political power led to an increasing factionalism within the nobility. A political crisis mounted. Famine and plague struck in 687 and returned in 702 to 711. Basques and Asturians of the northern mountains raided deeply into the settled regions. The closing of commerce with North Africa, consequent on the Islamic conquest, was a further and enormous blow. King Vititza tried to make good the grievous injuries entailing executions, exilings, and confiscations that had been inflicted upon the opposing faction. The Mozarabic chronicle tells us that, in a tumult, the Senatus, or Senate, acclaimed the Dux, that is the Duke of Baetica, Roderigo, as a usurping king. While he was in the north leading an expedition against the Basques, a number of Vititza's clientele, Julianus, the Count of Ceuta in North Africa, contacted the Saracens and promised them the aid of the faction of the Vitizzani if they came with an army to depose Rodericus. Julianus enabled the emir Tariq ibn Ziyad to ferry a largely Berber army of 7,000 men across the Straits of Gibraltar on the night of the 27th to 28th of April, 711 AD. The Battle of Horilate, Wadi Laka in Arabic, was fought on the 23rd of July. Rodericus' troops were destroyed by the Muslims due to the desertion in the midst of the fray of the Vititza faction, who went over to the Muslim side. Soon after, the capital, Toledo, was taken, and with it the royal treasury and the regalia fell into the hands of the plunderers. Such was the chaos and violence that there are almost no sources for the period of the conquest apart from the Christian Mozarabic chronicle of 754. There are little glimpses of cities and monasteries being burned and of other cities opening their gates to the Muslims in return for mercy and the Pact of Dimma, previously mentioned. Cordoba and Merida were besieged for months. We hear of large-scale plundering, the crucifixion of the Romano-Gothic leaders, the burning of cities, and the slaughter and enslavement of their citizens. These atrocities were accompanied, the Mozarabic chronicle tells us, by the derision, the inridendo, of the perpetrators. The Arabs, Syrians, and Persians who made up the elite among the Muslims settled, on orders from Damascus, around Cordoba in the south, while the sparsely settled and less fertile middle and north of the peninsula were designated for the Berbers. In just 4 years, the whole of Romano-Gothic Spain had fallen into Muslim hands. They had been actively aided by the Vititza faction, who opened some of the city's gates to them, and later by lords like Cassius, the dominus of Caesar Augusta, Saragossa, and of the Ebro Valley, who soon converted to Islam and took an Arabic name. The remaining Romano-Gothic aristocracy and other elements of the population fled north to Galicia and to the mountains of Cantabria, the Asturias. Others fled much further. The citizens of Tarragona made it as a community to Genoa, bringing the relics of their saint Fructuosus with them, and founding that city, which was to have such a great future. From then on, the region of the Ebro Valley was a Dar al-Harb, a house of war. The emirs of Zaragoza launched repeated expeditions against Pamplona and into the Asturias. In 722, a police action by Emir Munuza into these mountains was confronted in the pass at Cavadonga by Count Pelagius, Don Pelayo in modern Spanish. The Muslim force was wiped out. This victory became a legend and morale booster for the Christians, but it appeared to the emir in Cordoba as a mere flea bite. His main interest at this time was in pushing deep into Francia. But it was to this struggle for political survival in the Asturian mountains that the core of the future kingdoms of Leon and Castile owe their origins. But meanwhile, as already mentioned, the main thrust of the Muslims was into the northwest, into Francia. The processes of razzia for plunder and of jihad against the infidels did not slacken. For 3 decades, starting in 719 and lasting until 752, these incursions into Francia mounted in scale and in depth of penetration. Narbonne, Toulouse, Carcassonne, Nîmes, Arles, Avignon all suffered sieges and devastation at the hands of the Muslim raiding armies. Burgundia was struck. Autun was taken and sacked in 725. The whole region from the south of the Loire to the Pyrenees had, since the decline of the Western Roman imperial state 3 centuries previously, been ruled by local comites or counts. These were men whose ancestors had been members of the Roman senatorial ruling class and who were now culturally indistinguishable from their long Romanized Frankish and Gothic peers and rivals to the north and south. It is important to remember this distinction, though. The south of France was largely untouched by the Germanic elements that seeped into northern life in Gaul. It remained Roman, or one might say post-Roman. This is why the language of Occitania remains so much closer to the Roman vernacular than did the language of the north. The comes or count of Aquitania was Odo, who in 721 had destroyed a great Islamic army under the governor of Cordoba, who had been besieging Toulouse for the previous 3 months. This was a great relief and unaccustomed victory for the Christians. Pope Gregory II sent his warmest congratulations to him, showing a consciousness of the need to rally the princes of the north against the engulfing Islamic tide, of which he would have known the full extent across the entire Mediterranean, east and west. But such was the immense reach of the caliphate that in 739 a new governor of Cordoba was appointed from Damascus, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, who set about raising Ghazi fighting units drawn from Ifriqiya, Africa, Syria and Yemen, for jihad and plunder against the infidels in Francia. They assembled at Cordoba, and Abdul Rahman marched them north to undertake a major invasion of Aquitania, with the intention of finally conquering it. Count Odo met him at the Garonne and was defeated with enormous loss of life. Bordeaux was taken, sacked and burned. The whole of Aquitaine was set upon by the Muslim light cavalry units and was utterly laid waste. A Muslim chronicler tells us with some relish that, quote, "the Muslims smote their enemies and passed the river Garonne and laid waste the country and took captives without number. And that army went through all places like a desolating storm. Prosperity made those warriors insatiable," end quote. The Saracen main force moved forward northwards, heading, it is said, for the city of Saint Martin, Tours, on the central Loire. Again, the same chronicler says, Abdul Rahman and his host attacked Tours to gain still more spoil, and they fought against it so fiercely that they stormed it almost before the eyes of the army that came to save it. And the fury and the cruelty of the Muslims towards the inhabitants of the city were like the fury and cruelty of raging tigers, end quote. Odo, meanwhile, had fled to the court of the Franks, where the major domus, that is the great personage of the royal palace, Carolus Martellus, exercised power under the figurehead of the sacred Merovingian line, King Theudoricus IV, whom he himself had placed on the throne. Carolus, known to us as Charles the Hammer, Charles Martel, was rapidly reviving the military power of the Franks, of the house of Herstal in Austrasia. Carolus, previously a rival of Odo, saw that the Muslim invaders were now laying waste to his own Frankish cities and villages. He called the core of his army, the lords of Austrasia, and their contingents to assemble, together with the Neustrians, Alemanni, Thuringians, and Bavarians. The Burgundian lords hung back due to their own power struggle with him. The Christian host which moved west to Tours in the autumn of 732 was representative of the post-Roman society that had emerged over the previous 2 centuries. Many of the warriors from either side of the Rhine spoke their various dialects of German. The Neustrians spoke a sub-Latin vernacular which was to become early French. They were united in their way of life, their religion, and in their loyalty to the Pepinids of Herstal. Somewhere on the road between Tours and Poitiers, the two forces from either end of the civilizational spectrum found each other. Days were spent skirmishing and probing, until the moment came and a set battle was engaged. The same Muslim chronicler relates, quote, "Near the river Awar, the Loire, the two great hosts of the two languages and the two creeds were set in array against each other. The hearts of Abd-er-Rahman and his captains and men were filled with wrath and pride, and they were the first to begin to fight. The Muslim horsemen dashed fiercely and frequently forward against the battalions of the Franks, who resisted manfully, and many fell dead on either side, until the going down of the sun. Night parted the two armies, but in the grey of the morning the Muslims returned to the battle. Their horsemen had soon hewn their way into the centre of the Christian host, but many of the Muslims were fearful for the safety of the spoil which they had stored in their tents, and a false cry arose in their ranks that some of the enemy were plundering the camp, whereupon several squadrons of the Muslim horsemen rode off to protect their tents. But it seemed as if they fled, and all the host was troubled. While Abd-er-Rahman strove to check their tumult and lead them back to battle, the warriors of the Franks came around him, and he was pierced through with many spears, so that he died. Then all the host fled before the enemy, and many died in the flight." End quote. Over 1,000 years later, Edward Gibbon famously wrote the following passage from the comfort and unassailable security of his study at Lausanne. He imagined what might have been the fate of Europe had the Franks under Carolus not decisively driven back that pulse of the invasion of Christendom in 372 AD. Quote, "A victorious line of march had been prolonged above 1,000 miles from the Rock of Gibraltar to the banks of the Loire. The repetition of an equal space would have carried the Saracens to the confines of Poland and the highlands of Scotland. The Rhine is not more impassable than the Nile or the Euphrates, and the Arabian fleet might have sailed without a combat into the mouth of the Thames. Perhaps the interpretation of the Koran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford, and their pulpits might demonstrate to a circumcised people the sanctity and truth of the revelation of Mahomet." End quote. It has become morally fashionable for our contemporary historians to undermine and belittle the significance of the Battle of Poitiers. But Gibbon's historical vision still holds an undeniable truth. Over the intervening centuries, had things gone the other way, Europe would have become an extension of the Middle East, had not the Franks, by happy fortune, at that moment in history, been possessed of sufficient political unity under a resolute leader. What made the Battle of Poitiers not a mere flash in the pan, not a lucky victory with no consequences, was that it was the beginning of a struggle to retake southern Gaul from the Moors, which lasted for a further 35 years. The Franks pursued their campaign into Septimania and besieged and stormed Muslim-held cities like Avignon and Arles. This struggle entailed winning back to the Christian side those Gothic counts who had turned renegade and held cities with Muslim garrisons. Avignon shows us an example. The city had been handed over to the Saracens by the patricius Maurontius in 719. 3 years after Poitiers, Carolus's army besieged it. The Saracen garrison retreated to the high citadel. Today is his but a fine public park with views over the Rhone. The Frankish warriors assailed it by throwing ropes up and scaling the walls. They had to fight for it house by house until all the garrison was killed. Just 2 years later, the Moors took it again, and Carolus had to come and repeat the siege, which was once more successful. The Saracens were finally driven out of Gaul by 767 AD. The Lombards had already been in power in Italy for 180 years and had still not managed to extend their dominion over the whole peninsula. From the early 600s, the Bavarian queen Theodelinda had sought to Christianize and Catholicize the Lombard royal family, which she had married into. She founded a royal monastery at Monza, north of Milan, as the kernel of a Catholic counter-capital to the original Arian one at Pavia. By the reign of King Liutprand in the early 700s, the process of conversion was almost complete. The Lombards, like the Franks and the Goths before them, were securely attached to the Orthodox Church and to Roman culture. Yet the papal curia at the Lateran perceived that its political independence, its libertas, would be lost if the Lombards joined up their northern kingdom with the southern duchy of Spoleto and Benevento, and eliminated the exarch of Ravenna. Appeals were made to Constantinople for more troops and for money to pay them. On occasion, out of necessity, the popes sought to conciliate the Lombards, thereby defying imperial policy. When the Roman capital in Italy, Ravenna, finally fell to them in 733, the Pope, the Syrian Gregory III, contributed money to fund the army sent to retake it. Gregory was to be the last pope to adhere to the old Constantinian tradition of seeking the emperor's approval when he was elected in 731. For there were now serious differences within the Christian Church which set the emperors against the majority of the prelates and clergy in both the East and the West. This was the iconoclast dispute. We have mentioned at the outset the view that Christianity was a deviant Jewish monotheistic sect, which blended with time with aspects of the surrounding polytheistic religious sensibility, with Mediterranean culture. Over the intervening centuries, this sensibility had elaborated in ever richer and more profuse ways, culminating in the high iconic fervor of Heraclius's war against the Persians. Images of the divine personages were felt to bring the power and aid of the deity and semi-deities they represented, such as the Virgin and Child, having been painted on the gates of Constantinople during the siege of that city by the Avars. The icons brought aid, and to Roman emperors they brought victory. But for a century now, that aid had been spectacularly absent. Ever since the Saracens first erupted from the Arabian Peninsula, the Romans had experienced one calamity after another. It must have appeared to them that their whole world was collapsing. The military successes of the Muslims were attributed to the sinfulness of the Christians. Here is Patriarch Sophronius of Jerusalem in a passionate sermon at the moment of the loss of the city in 634. Quote, "I ask you, demand and beseech you for the love of Christ our Lord, for as much as it is in your power, let us correct ourselves, let us burn with repentance, let us purify ourselves by conversion, desist from acts hateful to God. If we force ourselves to do so, as friends and beloved of God, we will laugh at the fall of our Saracen enemies. We will soon see their death and final destruction." End quote. A century later, in 726, some had come to the definite conclusion that the fault involved lay in the worship of images painted onto pieces of wood, in idolatry, that ancient abhorrence of the Jews of the Old Testament. A puritanical fervor swept from the eastern frontier to Constantinople. Taking their cue from the equally fierce hatred of images by the Muslims, the imperial circle and the military officers went through a kind of conversion within their Christian sensibility, almost like a reformation. The victor who had saved Constantinople from the second siege in 717, Emperor Leo III, began to take measures to purify the empire in the eyes of God. He ordered, and apparently obtained, the obligatory baptism of all the Jews. Then he ordered the painting over of the famous image of Christ Pantocrator that marked the Chalke entrance gate to the great palace at Constantinople, replacing it with a simple cross. Edicts and church councils followed. There were image smashings and whitewashings all over the cities of the empire. There was consternation on all sides. Women of the nobility were appalled, as were the monks of the east and the west. Thousands were forced to flee, and they went west, to Sicily, southern Italy, to Rome and Ravenna, as they had fled before the Saracens. Pope Gregory II and Gregory III defied the emperor. They called councils of the church and did not hesitate to excommunicate their own emperor. Leo retaliated by removing the provinces of southern Italy, of Sicily and Illyria, from the orbit of the Patriarch of Rome and placing them under the Patriarchate of Constantinople. This, at a stroke, deprived the papacy of its patrimonial estates and revenues. Even the imperial capital in the west, Ravenna, revolted against the emperor and sided with the pope. The imperial fleet sent against Ravenna was destroyed in a storm, and accordingly, in 730, Ravenna began to act as an autonomous power, throwing off its subordination to Constantinople. The response of Pope Gregory III, who was a Romano-Syrian, was to turn to the newly triumphant power of Carolus Martellus in Francia. Carolus had written to the Pope announcing the news of his victory over the Saracens at Tours in 732. The Pope bestowed on him and his successors the title of Christianissimus in gratitude. The title, Très Chrétien in French, was used by the kings of the later emergent France down until the execution of Louis XVI in 1793. But the plea from the Pope that the Franks should come to the aid of the Bishop of Rome and chastise the Lombards fell on deaf ears. Charles Martel had Saracens to hunt out of Septimania. However, a psychological threshold had been crossed, perhaps by both sides. The Roman Curia, so heavily influenced by Romano-Greek culture and staffed by many Greek-speaking Romans, had turned away from the emperor, now in their eyes a flagrant and a dangerous heretic, and had sought to replace his protection with that of the Franks, the heirs of the barbarians of 3 centuries previously. We should appreciate the unprecedented and revolutionary character of this move. It was, in time, to turn the Christian world upside down. Here is the chant at the Lateran and the Vatican sung at this time. The verse, O Holy God, in Greek, O Aios Theos, and answered in Latin as Sanctus Deus. Here is the account related by Paulus Diaconus of the details of what was happening in the imperial capital at this time. Per idem tempus Leo Augustus ad Peoria progressus est. At this time, the Augustus, Leo, had come to carry out worse acts, such as compelling all the inhabitants of Constantinople, by force as well as by blandishments, to remove wherever they were to be found the images of the Saviour, of his Holy Mother, as well as of all the saints, and had them consign them to the flames in the middle of the city. And since the large part of the people were reluctant to carry out such an impious crime, he had some of them decapitated, and others had parts of their bodies mutilated." End quote. This extremely bitter religious and political conflict within Christianity came at a time when the Roman state was fighting for its life in Anatolia, and, to a lesser extent, in the Balkans. It was thereby rendered almost incapable of enforcing its authority and defending its territories in the West. The campaign of whitewashing, smashing and burning of religious images, which extended to the outlawing of the cult of the saints and of their relics, was a top-down reformation espoused primarily by the imperial family, the strategoi, the generals of the provincial districts, the themes, by officials at the imperial palace, and by a large section, but not all, of the bishops. It was fiercely resisted and resented by the very numerous monastic communities, by the ordinary believers, and by formidable theologians like John of Damascus, Theodore the Studite, and by the patriarch of that city, Germanus. The doctrine against images and the emperor's express edicts enforcing it were unanimously rejected by the bishops and clergy of the West. Christianity had always been extremely disputational and had been riven by conflicts since the 2nd century. Almost all of these had been about the nature of Christ within the Trinity and had been recycled in various forms over 5 centuries. Iconoclasm was different. It was a lurch towards monotheism and an attack upon the deepest iconographic traditions of Mediterranean civilization. It was a move away from the human towards the more severe numinous void of the ineffable deity. As John of Damascus argued, "'Tis a denial, in the final instance of the incarnation, that human face and human body of the deity, which was to have such a profound effect on the civilization that the then being born Europe was to explore down the centuries." Beyond the humanity of Christ lay, after centuries of spiritual and moral evolution, the concept of the dignity and elevation of humanity itself. And so we come to the moment in history when, from a complex concatenation of causes, we observe the critical change occur which was to set Latin Christendom onto its own path, unfolding from within its own inner nature and bringing to the world its own civilizational mission. The preconditions had been fermenting in the lands of the north and to the west of the Alps ever since the collapse of imperial rule in the Occident during the 400s. A coherent power center had solidified under the leadership of the Carolingians. The sense of a new center took root, the sense of new possibilities opening at the edges of the Occident. And now, in the midst of these rebalancings, the center of balance, Italy, shifted, and the center of the Italian balance was the Duchy of Rome, with its de facto secular ruler being, since the 590s, the patriarch of that city, the Pope. Rome, that is, the community of the papal court and the episcopal and monastic institutions it held influence over, turned its back on the Imperium Romanum. For the first time since the days of Constantine, the Roman Church took the portentous step of throwing off the authority of its protector, the emperor in Constantinople. This required an immense psychological lurch, a breakthrough to a new mentality and outlook, but it was one which fitted with the requirements of the time and which stuck and became permanent. In recognizing the revolutionary character of the change, we should not lose sight of the naturalness of the transition and of the force of necessity propelling it forward. For over a century, from the 590s, and to an increasing degree, the beleaguered imperial state of Constantinople had been in less and less of a position to project power and maintain its position in the West. It had lost Roman Africa outright and had been driven from southern Iberia, which in turn fell to the Saracens. It was respected but ignored by the complex politics of Transalpine Christian Europe in Francia. In Italy, it maintained its position more by the weight of tradition and the habit of mind of its subjects. In Sicily, Calabria, Naples, Rome, the Exarchate, and Venezia, the Lombards were repeatedly seizing this or that frontier fortress along the corridor running through central Italy, from Ravenna to Rome. They were just playing inter-Lombard politics. King Liutprand of Lombardy wanted to exert dynastic control over the Lombard duchies of Spoleto and Benevento, and to do so inevitably entailed the seizure of the Roman fortresses, narrowly separating him from them. He was what we might call a friendly adversary of the Romans, an energetic founder of monasteries and churches. He was by turns on excellent terms with the Pope, and could be persuaded, as he was to do so by Pope Zacharias, to hand back to the Bishop of Rome cities and fortresses that he had just conquered. But the popes of the mid-700s, accustomed, like all bishops for the previous 3 centuries, to being called upon by the local citizens and by the emperors to assume temporal, or as we would call it, political power, stepped forward quite naturally to assume their responsibilities. They raised armies, rebuilt the walls of Rome, paid tribute to the Lombards, cultivated close diplomatic relations with them, and picked up everywhere the reins of political power in Italy that the empire no longer had the strength to lift. And while all this was happening in Italy, the popes had been cultivating the spread of Christianity, specifically of the Roman Rite, into lands beyond the reach or ken of the emperor at Constantinople. And well they might. For them, new horizons were opening up where ancient ones were slipping away into the darkness. The whole period was overshadowed by the great transformation that had happened in the world. From Rome's point of view, the rich Latin south and the still greater and richer east of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean had been lopped off. The society and culture remaining on the northern shores of the Mediterranean hesitated, and then began to seek a new balance and center of gravity, one that was continental and no longer maritime, one that looked north and northeast across continental Europe. The Islamic world now enveloped Romano Christendom, and, stronger than it, posed a continuous mortal threat to its existence from multiple directions. For all these reasons combined, the military incapacity of the emperor in Italy, the long traditions of the bishop's political responsibilities, the widening horizons and direct authority of the papacy in Britannia and in central Germania, the mounting territorial pressure from the Lombards, the fall of Ravenna to them in 571, but above all the profound breach with the empire caused by the iconoclastic conflict. For all these reasons and more, gradually, step by step, the Roman papacy took the momentous decision to turn its back on the Roman Empire and to strike out on its own into uncharted waters. The initial steps involved were, in 731, Gregory III held a synod at Rome approving of images in religious life and excommunicating the iconoclasts, who included the emperor. In 739, the Pope, during one of the Lombard crises, appealed to Charles Martel to come to Italy. His successor, Pope Zacharias, defied imperial policy by entering into the closest terms of friendship with the Lombard king. In 749, King Pepinus, the holder of political power in Francia, sent Bishop Burchardus and Fulrad to pose the question to Pope Zacharias: is it just or not that the king of the Franks at this time possess absolutely no power and at the same time hold the royal office? End quote. The Carolingians needed papal authority to depose the traditional Merovingian line. King Childericus III and his son had their long sacral hair tonsured and were retired to the monastery of Saint-Bertin. The Pepinids, or Carolingians as they came to be called, took over the kingship of the Franks with papal blessing. A religio-political symbiosis was emerging between the Pepinids and the Roman papacy. Each found that they needed things the other had. In 753, Pope Stephanus II decided to deal with the problems of Italy in a radical manner. He did something unprecedented, previously in all time unimaginable. A bishop was always rooted in his civitas, his city. He set out from Rome with an entourage exhibiting the full pomp of the Patriarchate of the West, and made the long and arduous journey over the Alps in winter to arrive at the Palatium villa of King Pepinus at Ponthion in Champagne. This was an event of immense significance for the Franks also. On the approach of the papal party, Pepinus rode out with his sons Carolus, the future Charlemagne, and Carloman to meet them. Dismounting, the king humbly took the bridle of the Pope's mount and led it, as his servant, to the enclosure of the Palatium. Everything from then on went marvellously for both sides. The Pope later travelled to the Merovingian dynastic monastery and basilica at Saint-Denis, outside Paris, and consecrated the king and his sons again with the oil of the Holy Spirit, confirming and legitimizing his family's dynastic usurpation. In April of that fateful year of 574, at Carisiacum, Crécy in Picardy, negotiations took place in which Pope Stephen conferred on the King of the Franks the illustrious title of Patricius Romanorum, that is, Father Protector of the Roman people. He also laid out a detailed proposal that Perpinus should, as he put it, restore to the Bishop of Rome the rulership of Roman territory in Italy by forcing the Lombards to give up what they had taken. This meant, in fact, all and more of the Duchy of Rome, the whole Exarchate of Ravenna, and the duchies of Spoleto and Benevento, amounting to half of the peninsula. To Perpinus, this seemed only reasonable. The documents of the time, especially on the papal side, speak frequently of the res publica Romana, literally the public thing, the common interest or commonwealth of the Romans. The eminent modern historian Geoffrey Barraclough draws our attention to a resonant phrase used to elaborate this by then ancient term, the Sanctae Diei Ecclesiae Res Publica, which he found opaque in the extreme, but which we can understand in the mentality of the time to evoke the Republic of God of his Holy Church, the common cause of Christendom as embodied in the Church, a church whose primate was understood by the papal court and by the Franks to be the successor of St. Peter, the Servus Servorum Dei, the servant of the servants of God, the Pope. The agreement reached at Crécy in 754 was epoch-making. It sealed the formation of the Latin Occident, of Latin Christendom, by creating an axis between the north of Europe and Italy, specifically between the dominant political power on the continent with the Roman Patriarchate. The great turn away from the Roman Empire was greatly reinforced, affirmed, and now made a practical political enterprise. It would take another half-century before it reached its logical conclusion, with the coronation at Rome of Charlemagne as Roman Emperor in the West. But it was the papacy which took the initiative, which held the balance and was in a position to tip it. The King of the Franks was easily capable of standing up to the heretical and excommunicate emperors in Constantinople, locked as they were in struggle against the Saracens on land and sea, and still prey to challenges from an usurper, as happened in 742 by the general Atrabasdos. But military might would not have been enough. The vision, the ability to conceive the religious and political ambition of a whole and united West under Franco-Papal leadership, and the authority to carry it out, were beyond the capacities of the Franks alone. The papacy provided the ideological input, the religious, ecclesiastical, and political agenda for a new formation, a new self-understanding of the Latin West, as distinct from and independent of the traditional centre at Constantinople. In evoking so clearly the prospect of a Sanctae Diei Ecclesiae Res Publica, a Christian republic of the Church, the papacy was in the process of imagining and then of willing a destiny for Latin Christendom. That destiny, as we shall see, would be realized in the following centuries, and it would see Latin Christianity in the long term flourish and grow in capacity, as the Roman Empire correspondingly diminished. We look back upon the dynamic and expanding future Latin Christendom as the Middle Ages. However, Latin Christendom is the old name for the place and the society in which we live, which underwent a name change in the 1700s, and which we now call Europe.